Hello and welcome to Composting 101. My name is Cora Carter. I'm the Purdue Extension Educator in Bartholomew County for Ag and Natural Resources, and I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about composting. Composting actually helps the environment. Yard waste use up valuable space in our landfill, which is rapidly disappearing. These materials made up 20% of the landfills in 1993, and in 2017 that number is only down to 13%. Surely we can do better than that. In April to October each year is when the more yard waste goes into the landfills, and it's actually illegal to burn yard waste in Indiana, so we need to make sure that we are doing something that is productive with it. That's just letting you know that there are some rural uses for fires, but residential waste within the city limits is never permitted to be burned. Basic composting, it's really just a place where decomposers can go to town. So bacteria, they're the most abundant and most effective decomposers. They're the first ones to feed on the plant materials. And as they break down the plant materials, they produce heat, which warms the pile up, and that creates that atmosphere that you're looking for in a compost pile. Fungi and other one-celled organisms, insects, worms, even other like vermin will move in after that to help finish breaking down the compost. Any plant material, with some exceptions, we'll get into that in the future in the rest of the slides, can be composted. Yard waste, leaves, weeds, garden plants, those are excellent things to add to your compost. So every time you're pulling weeds in your garden, just set that aside in a pile and add it to your compost. Woody plant materials, like if you trim your shrubs or you take down a tree, those branches, it's better if you grind them up or cut them into really small pieces before you put them in your compost, because it will take a very long time and you may have to sift those out of your compost and keep them going in the pile longer than the rest of the materials because it will take them so long to decompose. Grass clippings are something you can put in the compost. But if you're mowing your lawn frequently enough, the amount of grass that you generate shouldn't be harmful to your grass, and that just generates compost for your lawn where it is. So it really is best to leave grass clippings on the lawn unless they are kind of heaped up and going to smother out pieces of your yard. Sawdust, raw fruit, vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, eggshells, a lot of your household waste there is something that you can include in your compost. Here's what not to compost. Any part of a black walnut tree. It actually contains a toxic substance that some plants can't handle, and it kills them or it causes them to do poorly. You can compost parts of a black walnut tree, but that compost needs to sit for several months up to years before it can be safely used on certain plants. If you know that your plants are not susceptible to the juglone toxin, then you might be able to use black walnut tree in your compost, but it's really just best to not have to worry about it and not put it in there. A lot of your fatty or meaty or oily foods are not great to put in there, primarily because they'll attract pests. If you want to put those in your compost, just know that you'll be attracting some mice or some raccoons or other types of vermin, so you may need to have a sturdier compost structure to house it. And this may cause your compost to be a little bit smellier than a normal compost. Any type of feces, especially obviously your cat or dog feces, are not a good idea, especially if you're going to be using that compost on vegetable crops. So if you're going to be putting it on your garden, definitely don't put cat or dog feces in with your regular compost, because that can still carry diseases. The heat of the composting process doesn't necessarily kill everything that those materials may carry. And any badly diseased or fungus infected plant material, it may not, likewise, may not heat up enough for decontamination. So if you know you've lost a tree or a shrub or a plant to a particular disease, then it's not advisable to put that or the leaves from that plant in the compost, because it may just, you may just reinfect your tree or your tomato plant or whatever with the fungus or the disease that you were fighting that killed the plant. So that's something to consider as well. Here's a quick biology lesson. All plants contain carbon and nitrogen, along with some other things. But microbes convert the carbon into energy and the nitrogen into protein. So they need both. A good balance is necessary for ideal composting. The ideal balance is 30 to 1. In other words, 30 parts of carbon to 1 part of nitrogen. And the next slide has some ratio examples. So this slide is broken up into your greens and your browns. If you've ever heard anything about compost, you hear a lot of talking about greens and browns. Well, the greens are ones with a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio, so they have more nitrogen, not more nitrogen than carbon, but they have more nitrogen in them than the browns, hence the greens idea. These are fresh manures, vegetable waste, grass clippings. Those are things that are greener. They have less carbon for every nitrogen. And then your browns are things that are traditionally brown. So leaves, straw, stalks, bark, chips, papers, things like that are your browns. So browns decay slower. They can keep your pile aerated, especially if you're using some of those sticks or branches and leaves. And they tie up the nitrogen in the soil if you don't fully compost them. So they need to be fully broken down before you can use them on your garden. You're going to create a lot more browns, especially if you rake up your leaves and you have plant trimmings and things like that. You may create a lot more browns than you have greens. So your household waste, any manures, of course, those things you have less of. So you need to kind of stockpile your browns, maybe to add them in the right kind of ratio. You want to have some greens and then some browns, and then some greens and then some browns in your pile. And we're going to go into that in just a little bit as well. But it's best to mix it all together. You can see in the chart that horse manure and leaves compost fairly quickly by themselves, but corn stalks and wood could use some help by adding some nitrogen high products like manure or vegetable waste to get a satisfactory reaction. So basically, you want some good mix. The best way to start a compost pile is you want to remove the grass or sod from the area so that the soil has direct contact with the compost material. A good size is 3 foot by 3 foot on the ground, or 5 foot by 5 foot. You can kind of make the bottom with some coarsely chopped woody materials so that it's got some aeration and excess water drains from the pile. That's not necessary. A lot of times our compost piles are not wet enough, so that's not that necessary. And then you start layering until you have a pile about 10 inches high. Then you wet it, and you're going to add some fertilizer to it. This is where you get some more nitrogen, because a lot of times we don't have enough of that greens. So you can either use commercial fertilizer or chicken livestock manure if you have that, a 2-inch layer of fresh manure, or a sprinkle of your commercial dry fertilizer, and that just gives more nitrogen to the pile to really help with the chemical reaction process. And then you can also add some soil, or for example, if you've cut out a new flower bed, you can add some sod chunks to it. That soil does give the microbes a chance to get into the compost, but that's not necessary either, especially if you've got a good ratio of browns to greens. You want to repeat the process until you have the size you desire. Water it every time you add new layers, and that you're going to see that pile shrink over time. So if you get it to be 6 to 10 inches tall, then that's going to shrink down as the composting process happens. Here's just a diagram of what you want. You want 8 to 10 inches of yard waste, an inch of soil, or potentially those greens in there, and then some fertilizer and water to make your stacks. You will want to mix it occasionally while it's going on too, so that there's not any pockets, particularly your leaves or your grass clippings can get kind of clumped together and block out oxygen so that the bacteria can't get in there and work on it. So you may have some clumps you need to break up. Surface area matters. So the smaller items are going to have higher surface area, and they're actually going to break down faster because there's more space for the microbes to feed. Grinding or chopping your materials speeds everything up. So if you want to take that banana peel and cut it into pieces, that will increase the speed of your composting. How big should your pile be? At least 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot, but less than, you don't want it to be enormous. So small piles will quit when it gets too cold outside because the microbes prefer a hot temperature inside. So they create some heat on their own, but that cold weather can get in there and kind of kill them and not allow them to continue going. That's okay if you don't mind that it pauses in the wintertime and you'll have to restart your pile again in the spring. On the other side, larger piles that are, excuse me, let me go back. Larger piles can smother the microbial oxygen because they need that oxygen, like I was saying earlier. So if you get too big, then oxygen can't get all the way through. Compost piles should be placed in a shaded area if you can, because they do dry out and you'll have to water them a lot more often. Just kind of make sure there's enough space for you to move around. You can spray it with a hose, and then it's close to where it's going to be used. It can be smelly, so if you want to put it further away from your house, just make sure that it's close to where you're going to use it so you don't have to truck your waste to it and you don't have to truck the compost back to your garden. You need to make sure that they aren't getting too dried out. If it's getting close to homogenization, it's all kind of turning into the same thing, you can squeeze it and see if it's too dry or not. If water runs out of it, it's too wet. If it's dusty, then it needs water. So it should be kind of a moist sponge kind of consistency. If you have the right balance of carbon and nitrogen and you have the right size and you've made sure it's moist, and you stir it around, then it should be working. It depends on what kind of particles you have in there, how active your microbes are, what the temperature is, what the moisture is. It could be 2 months when your pile goes from being 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot into compost, and it could be over a year or even more, especially if it stops in the wintertime. You can, when you're stirring it, you can feel the heat in the compost. You'll be able to tell it's working. It should be warm but not hot. If it's cold, it's not working. If it's hot, then it's not working right, because there are some microbes that it can be too hot for. It should be between 130 and 160 degrees. This should be hot enough to kill most diseases, insect eggs and weed seeds. If you put seeds down in there and cover them up pretty deep down in the compost, then they shouldn't sprout. Now, you may have plants that try and grow on the outside of the compost pile. That's completely normal and okay. It is something you add to your garden soil. It should be something that is fertile, but down in the soil, in the heat of the compost pile, should not be able to germinate seeds. Compost pile will go until there's nothing left. So if you don't use it when you can use it, then you'll lose it. So when is it ready to be used? It's ready when you can't tell what it was. It should have a consistency similar to soil. It won't smell bad. It'll just smell like dirt. And you can't tell which pieces are in there. Like I said, you can kind of sift out some of the parts that are woody and haven't completely broken down, and you can throw those back in the new pile, and you can get the compost out from underneath of it. Okay, now I'm going to go through just pretty quickly several different types of compost heaps, compost systems. This is a compost mound where you just put the compost on top of the ground. That's the simplest type of compost system. There are these compost pockets, which you kind of dig down in the ground and you let it work down in the ground. I don't recommend this so much because it is hard to turn those and determine when it's done and all of that. So I don't necessarily recommend that. This is a nice fancy system where you have a turning unit. These 3 different boxes you'll add to one until it's full, and then it'll be working while you add to the next one, etc., etc. Here's a cinder block version. Here's just a single cinder block bin, a snow fence bin. These are good because you want to get that air in the sides of it. So you want some airflow going through the compost. As long as you can get in there and turn it over, then this is a good place to put your compost. Here's a wooden version or a wire mesh version. This is even one you could do in a garbage can. Make sure you drill holes in there so that the air can get in there. There's also types of composters you can purchase on the internet or in a store, and you put food and leaves and plant matter in the top. You get compost out the bottom. These are difficult to turn. Some of them have turning systems in them. For example, this is a purchased one that rolls, and there are other ones that you can spin that have handles on them. This is even an indoor one that plugs in and it's powered and it turns it over on its own. This is for a very small amount of material. But this is something you could keep inside. Here's some simple tests for finished compost. You seal it in a plastic baggie for several days and it doesn't smell bad. Again, you can put a seed down inside of the compost. It's important to make sure that you can't germinate seeds down in it because you want those weed seeds from the weeds you pulled up last year to be killed before you use it. It can be used to improve soil structure. It's a food source for earthworms and adds nutrients to the soil. It can be used as a mulch, a soil additive, or a top dressing. If you're going to add it back to your yard, then it's fine to collect the lawn clippings and put them in your compost. Otherwise, like I said, your lawn clippings can be returned to the lawn straight away. Now, if you're using it as a soil amendment, which is something we add to the soil to improve soil health, you mix it into the top 4 to 6 inches. It'll help retain water and nutrients in sandy soils, and it'll help loosen compacted clay soils so that make sure that your compost is nice and dark and crumbly. If you're going to use it as a surface mulch, that you don't mix it in. Max of 3 inches of depth, and start out from the trunk of your trees or your shrubs about 3 to 4 inches, because if you get that compost touching the trunk of the tree, then you can cause some serious disease problems from moisture retention around the trunk where the trunk meets the ground. So make sure you come out from the tree. That goes for other mulches too, not just compost mulch. And extend it out to the drip line of the tree. This provides some temperature protection slows moisture loss, and also can smother out some weeds at first, at least. If you use it as a lawn top dressing, your compost needs to be very mature. Make sure that there's no, especially if you've got manure or you added nitrogen fertilizer to it, you want to make sure that it's all really mixed in, because you don't want to burn your lawn. And make sure you use really fine compost so that it's not big chunks sitting anywhere. This helps your lawn retain moisture and prevent compaction, but you need to be very judicious about how you use it. If you're going to use it as a potting mix in any of your container gardens, make sure that you don't add any more than 1/3 of compost by container volume, so that you don't injure your plants that way. Here's just a graph of how much compost to use, rates per 1,000 square feet. Like I said, this slide is going to be in your packet that'll be sent out to everybody after this program is over, so I'm not going to go over that directly, but this is how you can use it when you're establishing a lawn, when you're sowing grass seed, when you already have established grass, shrubs and trees in containers. Some common problems. I know I've personally had compost heaps or bins at every house I've ever owned, and I've had probably almost all of these problems, but it's just a kind of a series of trial and error. So if you've got some bad odors, then you probably need to add some more browns to your mix. If you've got your temperature is too cold, then your pile is probably too small, or there are a number of other things, but I would say it's probably too small. And your high temperatures, your pile is probably too large. If you've got pests, then you've probably got some meat or cheese or grease scraps that are in there, and those just attract pests. So either remove those from the pile or make your pile a little bit more secure. And those are some good ways to make sure that you're doing a good job. Some other ideas: if you have some limited space and you can't do a composter outside, you can do compost in a bag or in a tub. You just need to make sure that you're careful with your ratios. It's not quite as forgiving when you're doing a small amount of compost as it is when you're outside. So make sure you keep it moist and you're really careful about your greens and your browns. Compost tea. You want to put some finished compost in a bag or a cloth and put it in a 5-gallon bucket and add some water to it. So that's just going to extract those nutrients out of your compost. Nitrogen is a very volatile ingredient. It actually moves pretty easily in water. So if you're going to get some nitrogen out of your compost, you can easily do that by adding water to the compost and brew some tea that way. I think that's all I have. Here's my contact information. A lot of this information that is about compost can be found on this publication, which I'll also have sent out to you. It's from the University of Minnesota, and it's just a really good publication on composting. And then I want to encourage you, like I said, to complete the Qualtrics survey. And then does anybody have any questions they want to ask?
I have one.
Sure.
I started like in a plastic bin, a compost pile, back in the spring when we were all home. And I wasn't sure, and I don't think I've layered correctly. So if we're this far along and things are just so slow breaking down, how do you remedy that situation? Because I know I didn't put enough green in between layers and things. So I was kind of doing the best I can with what I was reading on the internet and stuff. And some directions were very vague and some were overwhelming, and I didn't want anything that big. So we just, it's not a huge pile. So
sure, it's not lost. There's certainly no way for you to lose it completely. If you don't think there's enough greens in it, then it's okay to go ahead and either start a new bin and use the bin you've got as your browns and mix the new greens in, or dig a big hole down in the middle and put some greens in there and start it all around, and just kind of start over. And you kind of just playing around with it. It's like making soup, you know, add some of that until it all works out.
Right.
It's a little bit, like I said, more forgiving the more you do, but you can kind of work back into having some working compost. Like I said,
I didn't realize, like, chopping like the food waste down into bits, because I would just throw in, like, whenever you're done peeling a cucumber, you know, I just throw the skins, you know, the peels in there. I just never thought of that. It really helps to chop them into little pieces.
For your softer things like cucumber peels or tomatoes or apples, you know, it doesn't matter as much. It's those really fibrous things, especially like your banana peels, those kind of things that are problematic when you're thinking about it, or the tree branches and bigger stuff like that. Most of your household waste is probably okay, unless you have like an entire orange that is rotten. Then maybe cut it into chunks before you put it in there.
Okay.
This, can you guys see? This is the compost area. We actually happen to have somebody here that's dropping some stuff off, so I won't video that person. Anything that gets collected through the city's yard waste program, if you've got one of their yard waste toters, when they come around and collect the leaves, I'm trying to block my microphone so it's not as windy, or the brush that they collect comes here to this facility. So right now we're down at the low end, which we just call the lower end. And this is where all of the green stuff is. Actually, if you look at it, there's a lot of browns here too, but there's nothing woody at this end. That's supposed to go up on the hill. So the hill's up there where those trees are. And that, the woody stuff, like the branches they pick up, the bushes, that gets mulched. It's chipped up and turned into mulch. So this is the raw pile of materials that gets brought to us by residents, but also by like Engledow. They happen to bring us stuff. And as I'm standing here looking at it, I'm like, well, this is clearly woody. There's a shrub there. But for the most part, it's supposed to just be the leaves and grass clippings and flowers. So there's a bunch of cannas that look like got pulled out of like an industrial planting. And sorry, the plant nerd in me is like, oh, look, there's sedum, there's this. Anyway, what happens is this pile gets moved around and turned into these long rows over here. So this is kind of like the finished product down here. And so the reason why we have this, it's several acres. I mean, we aren't really managing back there too much. It's kind of weedy, but it's several acres that we do create the compost on. And it helps us to keep thousands of tons of yard waste out of the landfill, which saves space for the stuff that can't be composted or recycled. So the nice thing about this is that when it is the finished stuff, it's free to come and get. So if somebody does not have room to make a compost pile at their house, this is a nice alternative to just come and get the compost when it's finished. But I do want to talk about, I'm going to walk back here, there's a sign of things that we can't accept. So we don't have the right permit from IDEM, Indiana Department of Environmental Management, to compost food waste. So everything has to be yard waste. Let's say you ripped out your tomatoes at the end of the year and there might have been a couple left on the vine. That's fine, because look, there's a tomato right there. But we can't take stuff from your kitchen. No banana peels, no eggs, nothing like that. So maybe that's where you have a small compost container at home, and then the bigger stuff you can bring to us, like your yard waste. So let me go to the other side of this sign because, all right. So no woody stuff, no brush, no sticks, no bushes, and definitely no plastic trash bags. If you do bring us the materials in a trash bag, you can just put it in the dumpster that's right over there. Or take it with you because there's no lid on that, so it's probably gonna blow away anyway. Grass clippings, leaves, flowers that you've ripped out. We can take some fruit from like a tree. I'm not no nuts. But if you had like fallen apples, we could take that. Thatch. If you've got some sod that you've ripped up, if you just have a small amount of dirt, we can take that. But it's not really meant for disposing of large quantities of soil. And most of the things that we will take are also, they're listed on our website, but they're also listed on the city's program because they don't want the woody stuff in the toters. They would like for you to put the woody stuff to the side. And if I remember correctly, it says it picks it up on your trash day. So just keep that in mind that the city does pick up for curbside, but eventually it all ends up here. So I'm actually going to move out of the way. There's Mike. He's the person that will load you on Fridays, but he also is the person that turns all of this stuff into the wondrous black gold that we have. So does anybody have questions about basically what we can do down here? There's some bushes there, but they'll get moved. I also saw some walnuts, but they're off to the side. I don't know if I can see questions. Let me see here.
I can read any questions if there's any in the chat, but if somebody wants to come off mute, then.
But that's all that really I wanted to talk about was, we've got several acres. How many acres do we have, Mike? 10 acres down here to make compost in. So several thousand tons of yard waste each year that we manage. I'll switch it back so that it's not just looking at compost if I can. There we go. Maybe. There we are. Yeah, it's a little windy down here today. We appreciate everybody joining us today, this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. That was really eye-opening for me too. I'd never seen that facility either, so I really appreciate.
Yeah, so and I was just going to add that residents can bring it to us. I mean, pretty much it's open whenever, as long as it's daylight. You can come down here. You just come down. Oh, I'm trying to show it to you and you can't see it, but come around the backside of our facility. There's no gates necessarily, so just make sure that there's no trash because that's gonna make Mike mad. He has to pick it out by hand. So that's all I've got. So thanks, Cora, for partnering with us and doing the heavy lifting on this one.
Yeah, no problem. That was fun. We had a good time. If you have any more questions, you can certainly contact me or Jessica afterwards with our email addresses. I'll share those, and then you can ask questions away if you want.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye.